Goddard is in. Goddard in alone with Stewart. Back in. Scores! Over the blue line, space. Philly on near circle. Backdoor feed. What a blocker save by Portillo! Here comes Halliday. Left wing joined by Beck. Halliday will sauce it for Beck. Stick lift. Forehand. What a goal! For plenty of time and space, walking in near circle, to the back end of the slot, Bieber beats it, tucks it in, what a goal! Cross ice, D. St. Val has it, backdoor shot, what a save, Portillo, it's loose, and another save, right pad, he's miraculous!
Welcome to our house. You're listening to the Fighting Saints Report.
I welcome you into the Fighting Saints Report, the podcast version. We're not going live over the airwaves anymore, but we still want to bring you all the great content that we try to bring throughout the season. And with the season ending early, we have the opportunity to recap a lot of good things that happened this season. As I welcome you into this edition of the Fighting Saints Report, Jack Milewski joined an appropriate social distance away from Jim Leitner. I think 14 hours covers the guidelines set by the CDC.
Correct. I think it's it was kind of funny. I saw where up in Canada they're saying that proper social distancing is actually a hockey stick length away. So it's leave it to the people up in Canada to come up with something creative to figure out how far acceptable social distance is.
That means if you were going based off Zdeno Chara's hockey stick, you just have overkill for your social distance guidelines.
Exactly.
But that's a good visual for us. We can probably abide by that rule as well, since we're talking hockey all the time. Social distancing, stay a hockey stick away from each other at all times to hopefully help stop the spread of this as quickly as possible. But what we wanted to do today was we've been talking about different ways we can highlight how great this season was and how exciting it was. And right now on social media, we're doing a contest, the top 10 games of the season. A lot of our fans are voting on that, and then we're going to unveil the top 5 as voted on by the fans next week. But what we wanted to do was we had a collection of games that we felt were some of the best this year, our top 5. And so we just wanted to break down each of those games and how exciting they were from a broadcast standpoint and from just a fan perspective. And most of these games that we have on our list were in the top 10 that we put out on social media. So it'll be interesting to see if the fans agree with our assessment in what these top 5 of the season were. And I think at least for this team, there were more than just these 5 that you could have fit in a top 5. So it's not an exact science, but I think there were a lot of great games you certainly could have put into a top 5, let alone a top 10.
Oh, no doubt about it. And I think for our purposes, I think we tried to find games that were a little bit different or had a different kind of, different kind of theme or different kind of storyline. I think, there were a couple games that were, blowout wins. We didn't look at both of those, although those could have been those, or a couple more than a couple that could have been in the top 5. But we kind of tried to go with a little different theme and a little different look at some different games. So just a little bit better variety.
We'll go in chronological order here for these games. And so the first one we start off with is one that happened very early in the season. It was actually the 4th game of the season for the Fighting Saints, and that was on October 13th against the Tri-City Storm. It was a 1-game weekend. It was a Sunday afternoon game in Tri-City for the Fighting Saints. And this is a big one even before you get to the game and how the outcome happened, because you just don't want to make an 8-hour bus ride for one game and not win that one game. And so the Fighting Saints were able to get the victory. And how they did it was even more impressive because, as we had talked about all season long, Tri-City's just so structurally sound defensively. They're tough to play against. And when we recap this game the week after with the Fighting Saints report, we talked about how for 55 minutes of that game, Tri-City played a near perfect game and stifling a great start for the Fighting Saints.
Yeah, and they did. They played an outstanding game. And like you mentioned, that was Dubuque's first, that was their only game of the weekend. And even, I guess, a little bit deeper dive into their season. That was the 4th game of the season. That was a 1-game weekend. The previous weekend was a 1-game weekend. Mm-hmm. And then, so this was actually the 3rd weekend of the season. They played 2 games on the first weekend. one game on the second weekend and one game on this third. And, remembering back to that time, I think the guys they were all itching to play more games, and, they were only playing one game a week. It was kind of like a football schedule more than anything else. And so I know the guys were, excited to play hockey games. And, I think it can be kind of detrimental when you're not playing a lot at the beginning of the season. And, it's hard to get into a game flow, and you're spending an entire week of practice just for one game. There's a difference between practice shape and game shape. And, I think at that point, I don't know that the Fighting Saints were in the best of game shape because they weren't playing a lot of games. But as you mentioned, Tri-City came out and played a great game. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that might have been their second or third game of that weekend. I think it was just their second game. But so they were probably in a little bit better of a flow. And again, you mentioned you make an 8-hour trip out to Tri-City, you want to make the most of it. And, after kind of a sluggish, start of the game, I think they did.
Yeah, from what I remember, Tri-City was their second game, but they actually had played earlier that week, maybe a Wednesday or a Thursday that week. And then the night before, they were in Waterloo. So they had played the night before, not gotten back to Tri-City till about 4 or 5 in the morning, and had to wake up and play an afternoon game. So both teams, it was unorthodox weeks for different reasons. But yeah, Tri-City was dominant. Eric Portillo made a couple big saves to keep Dubuque in that game, especially in the third period. But the shots were in the low 20s heading into the final 5 minutes. And then Dubuque scores 3 times in the last 5:30. They got a power play goal from Ty Jackson. And then the big moment, the reason this becomes one of the top 5 games outside of just being able to fight back on the road, is Reese Gaber scoring the game winner with 21 seconds left in regulation. And 21 seconds left, no matter what, and you score the game winner, that's a big deal. But the fact that Dubuque had been stifled for the first 55 minutes of that game and had gotten nothing offensively, I think pushes this game over the top. And anytime you have a last second game winner, I remember the reaction for an early season game. It was a very enthusiastic response by Gaber and the rest of the team. So that was a huge goal to set the tone for what Gaber did the entire season.
Yeah, I remember that at that point in the season, the Fighting Saints they were playing a lot of real close hockey games, and they were all tight 1-goal games. And there were a lot of games at that early start of the season like this, where they weren't scoring a lot of goals, and they were keeping everything tight, and they were finding a way in the third period. And I think that this was a game that was really indicative of that theme to the season, where they were finding, at the beginning of the season, they were finding ways to win hockey games. And at the first, they were I think they were 0 for 3 on the power play before Ty Jackson scored that equalizer. And I think that's really where the momentum shift. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it was a turnover, on the part of Tri-City that led to Reese Gaber's game-winning goal. And, I think that was just a matter of, you knew Tri-City was going to be a little bit tired because of all the travel, and, it was in a difficult situation. It was just a matter of biding their time and capitalizing when the circumstances warranted. And, that was when they did that. And I think the first maybe couple months of the season, it was very similar to that, where, they found ways to win those games in the third period. And they certainly did that in this game on October 13th.
Antonio Venuto adds an empty netter at the end of that game, but the Fighting Saints, that was a big character win early on in the season. And this wasn't a team that was down that much throughout the year. We mentioned how many blowout wins we went through looking for the top 5 games, but this did show that even when a team that has had a lot of success this season had their backs against the wall, they never gave up. And that was a really early indication of what this team was made of. So game number 1 on our list, October 13th against Tri-City, Gaber, the game winner with 21 seconds left. The next game is a completely different one that we have on our list, but a historic game for not just the Fighting Saints, but for anyone in the USHL, and that's November 22nd. This is one of 2 times that the Fighting Saints beat the Waterloo Blackhawks at the Young Arena by 6 goals. But when they did it on November 22nd, a 7-1 victory in which Matthew Copperwood had a hat trick, it was the very first time in the 17-year Tier 1 era that Waterloo had been beaten by 6 goals or more by someone on their home ice. So it was crazy to find out that stat shortly after the game ended, and to see that game in person. It was domination from the puck drop to the final whistle.
Yeah, and I think this was a great bounce back because they'd played them earlier in the month and lost 3-2 at home at Mystique. And, you know, it was a great bounce back because the Fighting Saints, I think that first game when they lost 3-2, I thought they were, for at least 40 minutes, I thought they were the better of the two teams. And they just kind of shot themselves in the foot with a couple penalties in the third period. And, you know, I think there's a penalty shot goal that was a big factor for Wyatt Chingothi in that first game. And this was what I really liked about this bounce back was, you know, for many years, Waterloo has kind of had Dubuque's number. They've been a frustrating team to play against. And that first meeting, I think that was, you know, a continuation of that frustration. Mm-hmm. And this was a game where they just said, all right, we can skate with Waterloo. We can play with them. We can beat them. And they did it in emphatic fashion. And I think that was, it was still relatively early in the season, but I thought that was a really important win because it showed that you could beat, you know, one of the really elite teams in the USHL, and not just beat them, but beat them handily. And I think that was a big key. And this was a game too that was a relatively close game for probably 20 minutes or so. And Waterloo had a real nice pushback. But instead of allowing Waterloo back into this game, they put their foot on the accelerator and really opened it up in that third period with 3 more goals to make it 7-1.
Yeah, and not only was it a 7-1 victory, as we have alluded to, that's probably the big portion of this game that puts it into the top 5, but also Matthew Copperwood has a hat trick, the first hat trick of the season for the Fighting Saints this year, in a year that they had 4 total hat tricks from different members of the team. So that was a little bit of a cherry on top to a game that already really had everything in terms of success for the Fighting Saints.
Yeah, and that was I think that's really when Matthew really started to really exert himself, because up until that point, I think he only had 2 goals. You know, so he more than doubled his goal output, and you know he was a outstanding player, and with the Saints got him because of his ability to shoot the puck, you know, which is something that they really didn't have a lot of last season. And he went out and really exerted himself and had a great game. And for my money, I thought he was going to for sure be the offensive player of the week in the USHL that week, but he wasn't. That was an outstanding game for him. And, he scored some really important goals in that game too. I think he scored the first 2 goals in the first period, and then he scored the 5th goal, which was a nice answer because it came shortly after Waterloo scored. And that really kind of sealed the game because Waterloo was starting to get back into the game. They started to have a real nice push. And for him to score that goal, it really seemed like it took a lot of wind out of Waterloo's sails when he scored that 5th goal and the hat trick goal to put it out of reach.
Yeah, big goal from Copperwood and a huge statement by the Fighting Saints. And we didn't have the second goal or second game of this nature in the top 5 just because we didn't want to essentially have a duplicate, but it can almost be grouped together in the sense that they completed this feat of beating Waterloo by 6, not just once, but twice in the same season. And I believe it was in back-to-back trips to Young Arena as well. So pretty incredible stuff by the Fighting Saints there. And certainly that milestone in and of itself will be highlighted this by how great it was and that it happened multiple times this season. We'll continue now with the countdown. We've got 3 more games left. We're going to get you 1 more game now, then the interview that we did with former Fighting Saint Nate Sucese, catching up with him in his professional career that just took a big step forward with him signing the contract with the Arizona Coyotes, and then we'll come back with the final 2 games. But as we move along here in chronological order, we go from one hat trick to another, but again, a hat trick for a historic reason, and that was December 6th. against Muskegon, Braden Doyle becomes the first Fighting Saints defenseman in the Tier 1 era to record a hat trick.
Yeah, that was an outstanding game. And I remember that was a point where, just prior to that, Coach Oliver David was really encouraging Braden Doyle to step up into the rush and, to really exert himself more offensively than he had been. When he first came here, he played prep school last year, and his main focus coming in was just to really work on the defensive side of his game, because he knew that's what he really needed to work on heading forward before he goes off to college. And I think he was really a lot more focused on the defensive end, and a conversation with the coaching staff to really encourage him to get more involved in the offense, jump up into the play, and exert himself. I think that's really what happened. And that's not as easy as it sounds, because when you're a defenseman jumping up into the play, it's not a real. You have to do it with caution, and you have to be smart about it. You can't just go up there and just jump in for the sake of jumping in. You have to understand how your forwards can get back and cover the point for you, or cover defensively if you're jumping up into the rush. And so it does take an adjustment, especially when you go from prep school to the USHL level. It took him a little while to do that, but this was, I think, really the first game where he really started to exert himself offensively and jump into the play, like Coach David said. And it was an outstanding breakthrough game for him.
And that was a part of a weekend sweep for the Fighting Saints. So it was a theme that was pretty prevalent this entire season, of winning not one but two games during a weekend. And Doyle had the only goal of the game through the first two periods for the Fighting Saints. Then he got goal number 2. Then the Fighting Saints took off in the third period, got a couple more as well after Doyle's. But his final goal, the hat trick goal, was a very impressive goal. And I know you talked to him after the game. I did as well. And he said after the game, I asked him, I said, it really seemed like on that goal, you knew that if you scored here, it was going to be the hat trick. And, he admitted it right away. He said, yeah, the hat trick was kind of the only thing he had in his mind at that point, because it normally isn't a move that you make as a defenseman. You catch it at the blue line and you basically try to take on the entire team by yourself to score. Usually you don't make that move as a defenseman, but where that game was in terms of already being out of reach in the Fighting Saints' favor, and where Doyle was with 2 goals, it was a worthwhile risk that then paid off in spades when he found the back of the net.
Yeah, and the cool thing too is, and talking to him afterwards, and mentioning to him or pointing out to him that was a first hat trick by a defenseman in the USHL Tier 1 history for the Saints. He was actually kind of taken back by that, or he was kind of a little surprised by that, because Dubuque has had some really nice defensemen, really good high-scoring defensemen in the last 10 years. And, it was kind of cool that he understood the history, and he understood some of the names of defensemen that came before him, and he really appreciated that the fact that he was the first one to do it. And, I think that was kind of cool too. But you're right, that was a great move by him to seal off that hat trick and really seal off an impressive win against a Muskegon team.
Yeah, that individual accomplishment alone makes it a great game for the Fighting Saints, and the main reason it makes our list. But also it was just a clinical performance, which we saw a lot of from the Fighting Saints in dismantling the opposition. And the Fighting Saints win that game. They go on to sweep that weekend series with Muskegon. We'll take our first break on the show, and when we come back, you'll hear my interview with Saint for Life Nate Sucese as we talk about his career at Penn State, his favorite moments from Dubuque, and also him signing a contract with the Arizona Coyotes, his first professional NHL contract. Back in a moment on the Fighting Saints Report. And now we welcome a very special guest here onto the show. It's former Fighting Saint. If we were posting it on Twitter, it would be Saint for Life, Nate Sucese. And Nate, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Nate, obviously former Fighting Saint, just finished your Penn State career. We'll get into that a little bit because I know it's not the ending that anyone wanted right now in the sports world. But most recently, let's start with the fact that you are now a member of the Arizona Coyotes. You signed that entry-level deal just a couple weeks ago. And so when you look at the signing that deal and what went into the process, when you finally inked that deal, what was the overall feeling?
It was just a feeling of achievement. There's been a lot of hard work, not only by me, but all my family members with time and obviously money put into this crazy sport that we play. So to be able to put the pen to paper was a huge accomplishment, and I'm ready to take advantage of the opportunity.
Yeah, and when you look at your career for Penn State, I don't want to delve too much into the abruptness and the end of the season because it's not what anyone wants to talk about right now. But just take us through. I'm sure it was about a 24-hour period where you get the news and you figure it out. Everyone's has different stories where they were, how it happened for them. But how did you end up finding out the news?
We were I live with three other guys in my class, and we were sitting on the couch. We just got done with Thursday workout and practice, getting ready to play in our semifinal game um, in the Big Ten tournament. And it was pretty hard to find out on Twitter. NCAA goes and cancels all the NCAA tournaments, and before the Big Ten had even canceled our tournament. So we went from earlier in the week playing without fans, being able to have four family members in the crowd, to 24 hours later getting the news of all of NCAA sports being canceled.
That being said, you do get to accomplish something that Penn State hockey had yet to do this season, and that's a regular season Big Ten title. Those last couple weeks were crazy, and the Big Ten, me being a Penn Stater, I got to follow it as well very closely, but it's so tough to win 2 games in a row in the Big Ten. I don't think people realize how tough that is. But when you were able to win those 2 games against Minnesota, and then you're watching from your couch the next weekend, finding out that you're in sole possession of the regular season title, what were those 2 weeks like?
It was crazy. We knew we had to the last weekend of the year. We actually had a bye, so our second to last weekend of the year was our regular season final games, and we had to get 5 out of 6 points to even give us a chance to get the regular season title. And then the next weekend when we had our bye, we were all watching everybody else's games, and there was 2 teams that had a chance to get 5 out of 6 points, which we did the weekend before to capture the title, and they didn't. So we ended up having a second bye in the first round of the Big Ten, and ultimately we never got to play our semifinal game. So to be able to go out, I guess, as a champion as for the regular season was, I guess, a cherry on top of, coming out of this bad situation in the sports world, if you want to put it that way.
And you go out a champion again, if you will. I know that hockey players are pretty humble, so they're not going to claim full ownership of a title without winning the tournament as well. But you came into Penn State as a champion as well, because your first season with the Nittany Lions was an incredible run through the Big Ten championship that culminates with Liam Folks' double overtime winner against Wisconsin. So to start at a program at Penn State that was pretty new by winning a Big Ten tournament, what was that first year like for you?
It was crazy, honestly. That's the only word to describe it. There was a lot of us coming in, I think 10 of us in our freshman class, and no one really knew what to expect because we had about half of a new team. And for our class to come in and have the impact that we did on the program, to be able to capture that championship in Detroit in double overtime, and then also the double overtime game before that in the semis against Minnesota. And a lot of the freshman class had a huge impact. If you want to look back at Peyton Jones being our starting goalie as a freshman, and then Dennis Smirnoff had a huge, I think, 47-point season that year. And then ultimately Liam Folks being a freshman, getting the pass from Brandon Byro, who was also a freshman, to score that game winner against Wisconsin to get the ring on our finger. And it kind of just came full circle, we thought, this year, with the Frozen Four being back in Detroit, where we had won the Big Ten championship, but ultimately never got to that point.
All those names that you just mentioned coming in with you at a freshman class as well, how nice of a feeling is it to know that you were part of a class that has been so instrumental in continuing to build what Penn State has started to build 7 years ago?
It's incredible. Those 3 names outside of Dennis Smirnoff were actually my roommates all 4 years. So for our apartment to kind of have the impact that we did on this program and the legacy leading forward, I hope the guys behind us take advantage of the opportunity and know that every day is different and you got to put in the work, but ultimately you don't have to be an upperclassman to make a difference. And I think that's what we did, hitting the ground running freshman year. And I think other classes, as our program gets on the map, will be able to do that right away.
And you won't just be remembered for those accolades that we just mentioned, but you're also going to be remembered, at least for the time being, as Penn State's all-time career points leader. When you hit that milestone, I know a lot of most players are all about team versus individual success, but was that kind of even a moment for you where you could step back and reflect and think, wow, look how far I've come in these 4 years?
Absolutely. I think you can take time to reflect on personal achievements personally. And getting that goal scoring title in Minnesota, where I had never scored a goal in my 4 years up until this year on the road in Minnesota, where I captured the goal scoring title, was super proud of myself for that achievement. And then ultimately at Robert Morris later on in January, getting the all-time points leading total over David Goodwin's was super, surreal. And to be able to have my name at the top of the leaderboard for the time being, at least, I'm sure it won't last long. It's something I can go down in history and move forward with and have that attached to my name.
Before we dive back into a couple of questions about the Fighting Saints, your time there, as you've had a little bit more time, obviously the emotions are still raw, but when you look back at your 4 years at Penn State, how do you try to sum that up if anyone asks, what was 4 years like playing at Pagula Ice Arena?
To have the opportunity to play in this atmosphere in front of the Roar Zone, for people that don't know, is our student section. They stand from the glass all the way up to the ceiling, and they made the Roar Zone as steep as code would allow them in Pennsylvania. So when you look out coming out of the tunnel on Friday and Saturday night and just see a wall of students behind the opposing net, and then obviously all of the alumni that always come back to watch us play, and the community members with a very big season ticket following, makes playing at Penn State something bigger than yourself. And it's pretty special.
So you got your USHL start with the Dubuque Fighting Saints. When you started playing for Dubuque, what are your first couple memories of coming from a lower level and starting to play at the USHL? What were the first couple memories about how the game felt, where you were at as a player, things like that?
Well, my first couple of games, actually my first one, I ended up getting absolutely blown up by a guy that's had a pretty successful career in the NHL. So I missed a few weeks right off the hop. But just the level of play and the style of play and how physical and fast it is, coming from, whether you're coming from playing prep or midget, it's a huge step. And I think me playing 2 years was the biggest attribute for my development. It takes probably about a half a year for me to even get my feet wet, it felt like, in the league. So that second year where I blossomed and had a really good year was huge for my development. And I think that allowed me to have an awesome freshman year as well.
Yeah, that was something that I actually had written down because this year's Fighting Saints team, a lot of people that are listening to this interview will know that the most successful players, the Jackson twins, Reese Gaber, they all came back for their second year in the USHL. So if you already started it, but if you're pitching a player that's on the fence about going to college or trying another year in the USHL, what would you say to them to make them stay that extra year in the USHL?
Well, I think a rule that I always had with my family was conquer the level that you were at, whether it was, playing minor midget and having another year of eligibility in that aspect, whether moving up to major midget or having another year junior. It never hurts. You don't want to rush the process. And for me to sign a deal as a turning 24-year-old, your time is never over, and the opportunities are always going to be there. But make sure that you take advantage of the level you're at and be where you're at. Especially, don't look forward to opportunities in the up and coming years, and take advantage of what you have at stake.
You mentioned taking about a half year to get your feet under yourself at the USHL level. When you got your feet under yourself and you could really focus on certain aspects of your game, what are a couple things you remember improving on a bunch in your 2 years in the USHL that really helped your freshman year at Penn State?
I think wall work as a winger is a huge attribute you can have in your game. Everyone knows, the danger zones from the tops of the circle to the blue line in your own zone, and then obviously in the O zone. You never want to turn over pucks high there. So I think my wall work really improved over my 2 years in the USHL, and then I played wing, moving on to center a few times, and then ultimately I ended as a center. But having the ability to get pucks out and be relied on in the D zone was a huge thing that I could move into the college ranks, and having the reliability of my coaches, knowing I could be out there in dire need situations, whether we're up a goal or down a goal.
You mentioned the craziness of playing in front of the Roar Zone at Pagula Ice Arena. For your junior hockey experience, what was it like coming out every night and playing at the Mesquite Community Ice Center?
It was incredible. Having the city around you, and kind of a small city. I'm from Rochester, New York, so Dubuque was definitely a smaller city for me. And seeing the support from the season ticket holders, the college students that come out on college night was awesome. And then obviously you got to give it up to the billet families that put so much time, effort, money into hosting us Fighting Saints players. They deserve all the credit for what they do, whether it's cooking your meals, making sure, your laundry's done, and everything above and beyond. They do it to the top notch.
You mentioned the billet families for Fighting Saints, and really for all of junior hockey, it doesn't exist without the billet families. That's, I think, part of the junior hockey experience that might be lost on a couple people is you're anywhere from 16 to 18 years old, and you're moving away from home. You're living with a completely new family. What was that feeling like to be living in a completely different household, different city for basically 9 months out of the year?
It was really nerve-wracking. Making my 15-hour drive from Rochester to Dubuque, I never really knew what to expect. But Dubuque's super lucky, at least for the time I was there, to have Patty as the billet coordinator, and then Joanne helping with all the academics. And they found me an awesome family with Robin and John Jackson. And their family took me in with open arms and kind of treated me like their own. And I've been fortunate enough for them to, they come to Minnesota when I was at Penn State. They came to Notre Dame a few times, and then obviously Wisconsin. And then they actually made a few trips out to Penn State as well. So if you can make an impact and make their lives easier, you'll be able to have a friendship and be part of their family for a lifetime.
Yeah, you mentioned Robin. Every single time I saw her over the last couple of years, she would always bring up your name because she knew I went to Penn State. So I always knew exactly what Nate Sucese's stat line was this last weekend, thanks to Robin. So that was always a nice keep up on Penn State hockey. But you mentioned the cooking of the meals. So was there a go-to meal at the Jackson household?
Not really. For dinner, John kind of took over the reins for that. But on Fridays, Robin actually worked her tail off from Monday to Thursday, her 40 hours, so that she could have Fridays off. And she would make, all of us our breakfast after pregame skate, and then have our pregame meal ready before we head out the door on Fridays for home games. So I give all the credit to both of them for the time they put in, and really all we had to do was show up. And so to have people like that in your corner and make things that much easier for you allows you to just concentrate on your play, and ultimately it leads to success.
2 years building a lot of great memories. Do you have one or two that, not necessarily on the ice or off the ice, but just in general, one or two memories that really stick out from your time in Dubuque?
One memory would have to be just the guys. We had such a close-knit group both years, with Keegan Ford, legendary names like him, Gambrell, Malone, Brett Boeing. You can go down the list, Gordy Green. But every Thursday night, we'd play poker with each other before home games or Xbox tournaments, and even knee hockey as 18-year-olds. So I think the close-knit group that we had off the ice led to success on the ice. And then I think one on-ice memory would have to have been when we were down, I think it was 4-1. Shane Kavanaugh had an absolute huge fight against Bloomington later in my second year, and we ended up winning the game 5-4 with I think we scored 4 goals in the last 8 minutes. and the momentum that a guy like him brought to the table, with whether it was his physical play or when he had to drop the gloves when needed, was just everyone knew that we had each other's backs, and there was never a time where we were going to quit.
I had another question that just popped to my mind. A lot of people on this year's team with the second-year players talk about not just the on-ice experience, but also the off-ice experience being such a big part of growth and staying for that second year. Did you have someone your first year that kind of took you under their wing, and then did you feel yourself transition to that role more your second year?
I think Gambrell was a huge mentor in my time in my first year. We ended up kind of being pretty good buddies and line mates for a better half of the year. And obviously he had an incredible first through third year at Denver, and he kind of hit the ground running his freshman year and ultimately got drafted. And he was a leader on the team with a letter on his shoulder. And ultimately the next year I ended up having a letter on my shoulder. So I could give him Sasha Larocque. I mean, you can go down the list with the veterans we had my first year, but and the coaching staff. OD being the assistant coach at the time, never gave up on me. He'd always have video clips to make me better. We'd go over a bunch of film, and then Coach Shaw gave me a bunch of opportunities moving forward. So I think the coaching staff and down to my teammates played a huge role for my success in my second year.
So you commit to Penn State and you go there after the Dubuque Fighting Saints. The names you mentioned before, some of your roommates, some of just the players on this Penn State team, a lot of names that were USHL names back in the day, back when you were playing. When you knew you were going to Penn State and kind of saw some of the guys you were going to be playing with, who was one you were really excited to play with that you knew from your time in the USHL?
One of them would have to be Peyton Jones, and then on the forward aspect, it'd be Dennis Smirnoff. He had success going back to his 16-year-old, playing with Indiana Ice, winning a championship with them ultimately before they didn't have a team anymore. And then Jones had an incredible second year in junior, as the same year I did, and he ultimately came in and was our starting goalie. And then Dennis led our team in points with, I think, 47 as a freshman, which is unheard of.
All right, Nate. Well, thanks so much for joining us. If you're up for it, we have some rapid-fire questions that I like to rattle off before the end of this interview, if you're in for that.
Go for it.
All right, absolutely. So the first one is favorite place to play in the USHL other than Dubuque?
Cedar Rapids.
Cedar Rapids. All right, go-to snack on the bus, a lot of long bus rides in the USHL.
I was a big Gushers and Oreo guy.
Give us the go-to song that you had blaring in your headphones before a game.
Welcome to the Jungle or X Gonna Give It To You by DMX.
Do you have any hockey superstitions?
I got all of them. It would take me too long to go through them, but everything starts on the right side. And then Thursday nights, I spend about 2.5 hours taping my sticks and spending time stretching in the Normatec boots.
Someone comes to State College and they say, where's the best go-to place for a late night eat? Where are you telling them to go?
College pizza.
Finally, obviously everyone's kind of spending a lot of time at home right now. So give us your go-to 1 or 2 shows on Netflix right now that you're watching.
I'm watching Ozark right now and All American.
All righty. Perfect. Well, Nate, thanks so much for the time. Really appreciate you doing this with us.
Yeah, no problem, Jack. Anytime.
Thank you. And now we welcome you back to the Fighting Saints Report. Jack Milewski, joined by Jim Leitner once again. Hope you enjoyed that interview with Nate Sucese. And if you want to continue to tune in and hear from former Fighting Saints, be sure to tune in every single week for the Fighting Saints Report. We've got a couple other interviews lined up already. We'll have Willie Neerum on the show in the coming weeks. We'll have Austin Rushoff and also Hunter Miska, a couple interviews that we have in the works for you guys to enjoy some hockey in a time that doesn't have much hockey. But as we get back to our top 10 countdown, Jim's here with 2 more games that we really wanted to get into. But before we do that, Jim, we have to, I think, talk a little bit about Nate Sucese, because as you heard in the interview, obviously ecstatic to sign that contract with the Arizona Coyotes. But he put together a great career with the Fighting Saints, and then all he did was went on to become Penn State's all-time leading point scorer and all-time leading goal scorer in the 4 years he spent with the Nittany Lions. A pretty impressive jump from juniors to college, and now hopefully an impressive jump from college to the pros as well.
Yeah, he's one of those guys that I think he was one of the players that the fans could really relate to, and I guess in modern terms, he kind of reminded me a lot of Reese Gaber. When he was here in Dubuque, just a guy who had such an incredible drive and such an incredible passion for the game. And, it seemed like he played when he ever had a little bit of a chip on his shoulder, he always seemed to take his game up a notch. And a couple of stories that I really, really liked about him that people might not have seen. Obviously, when he first started here, he had an injury with his spleen and he couldn't play for a month. And, but he came back better than ever after that and really had a great first season. But the other story was, I think it was in his second season, he got clipped in the mouth, and he had to wear a protective shield. And I remember seeing him at practice, and it was the first day that he had the shield on or a wire cage. It was either a cage or a shield. It was the first game that he had it on, and he was out there by himself practicing, and you could just see how frustrated he was because it wasn't comfortable. And, he hated the fact that he was not going to be able to play, or that his season was going to be interrupted a little bit because he still had a little discomfort. And, but it just showed how passionate he was about the game, and, how much he wanted to be out on the ice. Even if he had to wear a shield, he was going to do it to keep playing the game and keep contributing into the Fighting Saints. And that second year he was in Dubuque, he was dynamic, and it really showcased or really foreshadowed a lot of the success that he was going to have at Penn State.
And we talked about that during his interview as well. I wanted to ask him about that second year, because we talked about it so much this season with the Jackson twins and Reese Gaber and Kalen Taylor and Luke Robinson, and the list goes on and on of guys that decided to come back for a second year for Dubuque. And you saw how much that experience and how much that skill level developed from one year to the next, and how much that aided the Fighting Saints. And Sucese was the phrase he used is dominate the level you're at before you move on to the next level. And I think that was pretty relevant for a lot of players this year in Dubuque, with how important it is to have great success at one level before you decide to make that jump. There's no reason to rush it. And a lot of guys that didn't rush it, it paid off, even though they didn't get to finish the season. We didn't see how high those numbers climbed. The Jackson twins and Gaber are the perfect example of offensive studs that became elite players at the USHL level in their second season.
No doubt about it. And, those are guys that could have moved on very easily. They could have moved on this season, but, I think it's really important on two different levels. For one, it really helps the individual player. So when you go to that next level, you're not sitting on the bench, or you're not relegated to one of the lower lines. You're able to contribute right away because you're a lot more used to playing at a high level, and you have the confidence to play at a higher level. Mm-hmm. So that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it, obviously, from a Dubuque standpoint, is you're going to help the Fighting Saints be a lot more successful. And, I think there's a lot more players who are understanding that if they come back for that second year, or in some cases that third year, they can really take their games to another level, and they can, help the team too. And winning is a huge factor in how much success you're going to have at the next level too. If you come and you have a lot of success at the USHL level, you learn how to win in a very difficult league, it's going to benefit your game as well when you get to that next level.
Well, speaking of the next level, a player that for Fighting Saints fans, unfortunately, doesn't look like he's coming back next year, but was a big part of this next top 5 game that we're talking about. We'll go to January 24th, and it was one of the best games, one of the best performances of the season, I thought, for Eric Portillo in a 3-2 victory over the Omaha Lancers. And it wasn't just that Omaha fired 38 shots to Dubuque's 23 in that game, and Portillo had to stand on his head. But it was also just as a team, the context of that game, you win 9-3 the night before on home ice, and then have to travel immediately after the game through the night, at least part of it, to Omaha to play another game less than 24 hours afterwards. So fatigue's already a major factor for the Fighting Saints to gut out that victory and for Portillo to perform the way he did. I thought that was enough to push this into the top 5 just because of how good that Portillo performance was, but also how much the Fighting Saints as a team had to gut that 65 minutes out.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that another kind of theme that I noticed too, that the Saints were in that situation, a handful of times this year where they were playing a team that was a lot more rested, that was in a lot better shape because, the Fighting Saints were maybe playing their second game of the weekend while the other team was playing its first. And that's really difficult. I mean, no matter what level you're at or what age you're at, that's a difficult thing to do. And Omaha was a team that was really surging at that point, and they were playing really good hockey. And that's a tough challenge for a team, like no matter who you are, to go into a situation where you're playing a rested team after, playing the night before, expending a lot of energy. And they played the USA team the night before, and that's a team that likes to get up and skate. So, I mean, you're expending a lot of energy in a game like that where you're going out and you're going end to end and skating real hard. And so I think that was a difficult thing. But you're right. I think that was an outstanding effort by the Fighting Saints to bounce back the way they did and to have the kind of performance they did against a really good quality Omaha team that, probably should have won that game.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the, not the few examples, but one that was glaringly obvious because this season there were a lot of games that without Eric Portillo when he was in net, the Fighting Saints might not have won the game or might not have blown out the other team. But I think this was a stark example of a game they absolutely wouldn't have won if Portillo didn't perform the way he did in net. And I think there weren't as many of these games simply because the team that was in front of Portillo was so good so much of the time that he didn't really have to stand on his head. And same when Aiden McCarthy was in net. The goaltenders didn't have to stand on their heads a lot of the time to win games, but they had two great goaltenders, and Portillo just had his night to shine between the pipes that could still perform at an elite level when the team in front of them wasn't performing up to their standards. And that's exactly what you saw from Portillo. For my money, it was probably the best goaltending performance of the season for any Fighting Saint, context included, for what the team had to do in front of him the night before, and then to come back and play 24 hours later. At times that game, it was Portillo against 4 or 5 Lancers because the Fighting Saints just didn't have a lot left in the tank.
Yeah, it really showcased, how good the goaltending was in Dubuque. That game really did. But, to your earlier point, I think, there were a lot of times, and, you'd hear it in post-game interviews with Coach David, where, the game might have been a 5-1 game or something like that. But the goaltenders made huge saves or really important saves when the outcome was still in doubt. And, it was a really good year, probably the best year for goaltenders in Dubuque, not only just having a great number one in Eric Portillo, but having an outstanding number 2 in Aiden McCarthy. And even Hobie Hedquist had a couple, an outing where he was really outstanding as well. So I think this was probably as good a year for goaltenders in Dubuque as we've ever seen.
And for the Fighting Saints, though Portillo looks likely to move on, the plan from what I've heard is McCarthy will likely be back for the Fighting Saints, and also Hobie Hedquist hasn't even become a full-time member of the Fighting Saints. So really, there's a lot of depth and there's a lot of skill in between the pipes for the foreseeable future for the Fighting Saints. But that was a game that I felt just highlighted that more so than any other this season. We have one more game in our top 5. And I'm going to preface this final game by saying that if I'm looking at this from the scope of just a casual fan with no ties to any team, for my money, this was the best game of the season that the Fighting Saints were a part of. If you don't have a side in the affair, this was the best game of the season, in my opinion. It had everything. It was a matchup between the top 2 teams in the league at that point. It went to overtime. It featured some highlight reel goals. It featured some great saves. It featured a comeback. It featured 11 combined goals, and the Fighting Saints didn't end up winning this game. But when I look back at the season and I think of this game, this is probably the most disappointing thing that didn't come from this season was what looked to be a surefire Eastern Conference Finals between the Fighting Saints and the Chicago Steel, because on March 7th, despite a furious comeback, Dubuque loses 6-5 in overtime to Chicago. But this was such a prime example of what I thought a playoff series would have looked like between these two teams. And it was an electric 65 minutes of hockey.
It was outstanding. And, the big thing was with the Fighting Saints is this was the fourth and final meeting with Chicago. Chicago had won the previous three. A couple of them were in real disappointing fashion. And one was, I think, a 7-2 loss. And, so, I mean, it was really an opportunity to the Fighting Saints to show, that they were on more of an even par with Chicago. I think they probably deserved more than just 1 point in the season series against Chicago. I think they probably deserved a couple wins in that, or at least one more win in that series. But this was one. It's the last game of the regular season series between the two teams. Chicago had already won the first three. It would have been very easy for the Fighting Saints to give up, trailing it going into the third period against a team that never lost when they were trailing after 2 periods. And to score 3 goals in the third period to force overtime, I thought that was a huge feather in their cap and, a real confidence booster in case they did eventually end up meeting Chicago in the Eastern Conference Finals. That obviously we don't have those now, but I think that was a real good confidence booster. And, I think you're right. I would have loved to see a playoff series between Chicago and Dubuque. I think it would have been really entertaining, and not just from the fans of the Fighting Saints or the Steel. I think it would have been a great series for fans around the entire USHL to watch that series.
And that was the second to last game. Obviously, we didn't know it at the time, but the second to last game that Dubuque would play in the 2019-2020 regular season. And it was nice that in that game, again, the Fighting Saints lost, but it was nice that Reese Gaber got career goal 56 in that game to become the Tier 1 leader for the Fighting Saints in career goals. He scored the 4th goal of the game for Dubuque, and obviously didn't score in the next game against Waterloo. But for a player that was probably going to become the first Fighting Saint to 40 goals in a single season, and at least I would say be 60 plus on his career, Gaber was going to set a few more records at least this season if it had continued. But nice to get that big one, and I think that's going to be a number that stands for a good amount of time, because you have to essentially average 30 goals over 2 seasons to hit the number that Gaber has right now. And that's really tough to do.
Yeah, it's going to be really difficult. And you look at the dynamic players like the Jacksons. They had their moments as rookies, but they really didn't. They didn't have outstanding. They had really good productive seasons their first year. But to do, like you said, to have 30 goals, average 30 goals over 2 seasons, which is really difficult to do. It's tough to have 1 30-goal season, let alone 2. And I think you're right. I think it is going to stand for quite a while, and that's appropriate. Coach David always said that Reese Gaber was kind of a signature saint. That was kind of his nickname for him, and it's true. He's a guy who was so gritty and loved the game, so passionate about the game, and it's appropriate that he has that record. And like you said, I think it's going to last for a while.
Well, those are the top 5 games that Jim and I decided on for this season, and you'll have your chance to immediately agree or rebut with this social media contest that we're doing. We're whittling down the top 10 to the top 5, and then we'll see which one reigns number 1. But just a way to highlight, I think, a great season that unfortunately didn't get a finality in any type of way, other than unfortunately having to come to an end the way it did. But a lot of great games to highlight with this team. We could have probably done another separate top 5 and been in complete agreement that those were the top 5 games of the season. Just shows you how good the Fighting Saints had it this year with this team. But make sure to vote on that social media contest. Make sure to tune in again next week, as we'll be talking to another former Fighting Saint and also figuring out how we can pass the time while still talking hockey. Jim, thanks again for taking the time to join me remotely here today.
No problem at all.
All righty, we'll talk to you guys, all of you, on this podcast next week.